Okay, so today's topic is on selecting desirable traits. We're going to look at how, or we're going to look at the ways rather, that both nature and humans can ensure traits in plants and animals that are desirable get passed on to future generations. So in other words, the things that we want to see from certain plants or that we want to see from certain animals, we want to make sure that those certain traits get passed on to future generations. There's natural selection, which is done in nature. There's artificial selection that's done by people. There's cloning, which we're going to have quite a good discussion about today, biotechnology, and risks of biotechnology. So first of all, natural selection. I think we've talked about this previously in this course, but here it is again. Natural selection is a theory that was mainly developed by a scientist named Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin noticed a huge amount of biological diversity while he was sailing around the world, and he wondered why certain animals and plants adapted to their environments in such specific ways. Basically, the whole idea of natural selection says that the animals and plants that have specific traits that help them survive, those are the ones that are going to live long enough to have children. And then, of course, those children will grow up, and then that cycle continues, right? So over a large amount of time, natural selection is theorized to cause certain animals and plants to change towards a certain genetic structure. So two examples on this page. The one on the left shows a bunch of mice. Some mice are tan color, other mice are very dark in color. The mice that are in an area where the ground is a very dark color have an easier chance of blending in with their environment. So predatory birds are less likely to spot those mice, and they're more likely to spot the tan mice, which stick out a little bit more. That's not to say that the dark mice don't get eaten as well. It's just that they're less likely to be spotted, so therefore they're more likely to survive a longer amount of time. Now, the picture on the right here with the giraffe, I think I have shown this one before. The idea with giraffes is over time, the giraffes with the longer necks were more likely to live long enough to reproduce. So therefore, the ones with the shorter necks were less likely, so that trait wasn't as likely to be passed on. So a longer neck in a giraffe was more likely to be passed on from one generation to the next. So the theory of natural selection can be summarized in 4 points. Point number 1 is all organisms try to produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Now, human beings, of course, are an exception to this. We're very civilized. We've come to a point where we don't need to do that. In the distant past, humans followed this as well. Humans would have several offspring. Many of the offspring would not make it to adulthood, and that's why, of course, humans would have so many offspring, because they wanted to have more than would possibly survive to maximize the chance that some of them make it to adulthood. Next point is there's incredible variation within species. Look around, look at different people, for instance. We're all very different. That's variation within one species. And we're not unique. Other species have lots of variation within them as well. Humans are not an exception. Some of the variations increase the chances of an organism surviving to reproduce. We've looked at that with giraffes, of course. The longer the neck, the more likely it is to get food, the more likely it is to live longer. And then the last one, over time, variations that are passed on lead to changes in the genetic characteristics of a species. It's important to note that this doesn't happen just in a little while. Like, we're not even talking 100 years, we're not even talking 1,000 years. This takes tens of thousands of years to work its way through. It takes a very long time for these variations to be passed on an entire population of a species. It takes time for this to be affecting how the species looks. One of the most famous things that Charles Darwin looked at was a certain type of bird called a finch, and he noticed that finches in different areas had different beak structures. So the beak structures he was able to figure out by watching these birds. They correlated with what those different finches actually did for food. So for, excuse me, for finches that ate seeds, they had beaks that were shaped in a certain way that would help them break into the seeds and get them open. There was a certain type of finch called a cactus finch, which eats, of course, cactus, and its beak was formed in such a specialized way that it was able to eat the cactus without actually being poked by the spines. There were several other types of finches that didn't eat seeds or cactus. They ate insects, and their beaks were also designed in such a way that they were able to eat insects more effectively, including the ones that were able to like dig into the dirt or dig into a tree, that kind of idea. And then there was another kind of finch that actually ate buds off of trees, and its beak was, of course, formed specially to help it carve the bud off of the tree itself, right? So in other words, over time, these different species of finches were able to develop beaks that help them adapt to their environment. Next up is artificial selection. So this is moving away from nature now and more talking about how human beings can artificially select certain traits. So artificial selection is the process of selecting and breeding individuals with desirable traits to produce offspring that have those desired traits. Now, depending on what we are looking for, the word desirable can mean different things. Again, whether it was for a plant or whether it was for an animal, desirable can mean different things, right? So humans have facilitated this with various animals and plants. We've selectively bred horses to be stronger and for certain looks. So in other words, because horses have been domesticated by people, they're under the ownership of human beings, we've actually been able to selectively breed the ones that have characteristics that we want. So whether it's strength, whether it's endurance, or whether it's even just the way they look. If we like the way a certain type of horse looks, we breed that so that that look gets passed to the next generation. Plants are where this becomes a much bigger deal, of course. We've really selectively bred certain plants. We breed fruits and vegetables with ideal characteristics so that we have more of those ideal fruits and vegetables to eat, right? So ideal characteristics for fruits and vegetables, as I'm sure you can imagine, would include larger or tastier or more resistant to weather and disease. Those sort of things are ideal when it comes to a plant for us. Another one we're going to talk about in just a second here is dog breeds. Dog breeds have been selected artificially by humans. All dogs actually have a common ancestor, so it doesn't matter if it's a Chihuahua or a Great Dane, they all have a common ancestor, and it's because of human beings that have selectively bred them that we have all these different little dog breeds. And here it is, right? So domesticated dogs all have wolves, believe it or not, as their common ancestor. Every dog that we have is actually a descendant of a wolf, right? It's just been bred down from an original wolf. That includes like things like Chihuahuas, right? So a Chihuahua has a very distant ancestor that is actually a wolf. That's very hard to believe, but it is true. So ancient humans, we're talking like 10,000 years ago at least, ancient humans started domesticating dogs by breeding wolves for certain characteristics and behaviors. So certain traits of certain wolves that were under human captivity were bred on purpose to produce offspring that had those characteristics. This process continues to this day with dog breeders. Dog breeders, like professional dog breeders, breed dogs in certain ways so that certain characteristics get passed on. And new dog breeds are continuously forming. There's a lot of dog breeds that exist today that didn't even exist 100 years ago. Dog breeding is a very, very fast-paced change, and we've been producing new breeds of dogs quite regularly. And yeah, and this picture kind of shows it, right? They all have that wolf as a common ancestor, and it kind of branches out. Cloning, here's where it gets really weird. So a clone, as we've talked about before, is a genetically identical copy of an entire organism. Now, the word clone can also refer to identical copies of some of an organism's cells or some of its genes even. But generally speaking, when we talk about cloning, we're talking about the whole organism itself, like producing an identical copy of that organism. Now, cloning happens through asexual reproduction in nature, right? And we've talked about that before. Certain things reproduce asexually, and that, of course, is a form of cloning. But science has actually found ways to create clones of plants and animals artificially. So in other words, in a laboratory. Cloning is considered the most extreme version of artificial selection. It's also the most labor intensive. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of like science involved in actually getting cloning to work. But it is another viable way that this is done. Now with plants, this can be useful to produce many new plants with the same characteristics as the original. I know I mentioned before with bananas, believe it or not, every banana that you buy in a grocery store is genetically identical. They are all clones of an original banana plant. They call it the Cavendish banana, and all of these bananas that are in grocery stores all around, you know, I was going to say the world, but really Canada and the United States for sure, are clones of this original Cavendish banana. Now, the reason I don't say the whole world is there's actually certain countries that have different types of bananas. We don't really see them in our grocery stores, and I can't name off the top of my head what the name of those bananas are. But Cavendish bananas, the ones you would generally think of when you go to the grocery store and get bananas, those are all genetic clones, right? And even if you were getting a Cavendish banana in like Russia, for example, just picking a random country, it's also a genetic clone of that original, right? And there's problems with that, which we'll get into a little later. Cloning of animals, however, is much more controversial. Some people feel it's ethically wrong to clone animals. So in other words, some people feel like it's just not like right to be cloning animals. Like cloning plants, not very many people seem to care. Some people do, but most people seem okay with it. Animals, there's kind of a divide. Some people think it's not right. And human cloning, just by the way, human cloning, the cloning of a human being, is illegal. Most countries around the world have set laws against it. Canada, of course, is one of them. But as far as we know, and I really hope I'm not wrong on this, but as far as we know, no human being has ever been cloned. There's real ethical issues with that. It kind of opens up, you know, a whole issue of problems, right, is what I'm trying to say here. It's just something that people aren't really comfortable with. There's a lot of like fiction that comes out where they talk about what some issues of cloning would be. Some would say that maybe one thing with human cloning would be certain people would be cloned to perform certain jobs, and then that would, create a market of clones, basically. It's kind of a big mess. It's hard to say that would ever happen, but bottom line is, right now, at least human cloning is legal. Now, what I want you to remind you of, though, the other side of this perspective, whereas some people say it's, ethically wrong, on the other hand, however, you got to remember that the clone is not the same organism. It's not literally making a full-blown, totally identical copy of the original. It's just a genetic copy of it. So keep in mind that the ideas and personality and memories of the original are not given to the clone. So let's say theoretically you were to clone yourself, right? Your clone is not you. It's just a genetic copy of you. It's almost like a very identical clone, or sorry, a very identical twin of yourself. That's kind of what it would be more like, right? Also keep in mind, when a clone is born, it's born as a baby, right? It's not like if you clone yourself at the age of 14 or 15 that your clone's going to immediately be 14 or 15 right at birth. That's not how it works either. It just creates a new genetic copy of yourself. Now, for the very first animal that was cloned, it was actually Dolly the sheep. Dolly the sheep was the first artificially created animal clone. She actually lived in Scotland from 1996 until 2003. So only about 6.5 years. And that's not a very long life for a sheep. Sheep usually live about 12 years. So it didn't really reach a full life expectancy. And there was a lot of debate as to why Dolly didn't reach a full life expectancy. Some people, especially a lot of the media, felt that this was because Dolly was created from a sheep that was already 6 years old. So in other words, some people felt that when Dolly the sheep was born, that Dolly, even though she was a baby sheep, was already genetically 6 years old. Scientists have disproved this. They don't believe that to be the case at all. I think there was some lung condition with Dolly the sheep. I don't remember exactly. I remember when she lived, and I remember when she died. It was quite a big news story when she died. But I think it was some lung condition, and it wasn't related to aging. It just, was an unfortunate situation. There have been many other animal clones that have lived since, many of which have lived normal length lives, despite the fact that they've been produced by clone parents that were already relatively aged themselves, right? In case you're wondering how the process works, you don't need to know this. It's extremely complicated, and I only have a very, very elementary grasp of it myself because it's pretty complex. But basically how it works is when you're cloning an organism, you actually need to have two different donors. There's the nuclear donor, so in other words, the one who's providing the DNA. Remember, DNA is located in the nucleus of a cell, right? So there's the nuclear donor who's providing that DNA, but then there's also something that they call a cytoplasmic donor. The cytoplasmic donor donates a cell. Now, we're not talking about the nucleus of the cell, but just a cell that can be used in order to produce a new offspring. Usually it's an egg cell, right? So it's going to be an egg cell, but the DNA, of course, is removed from that. My understanding is they take the DNA, so the nuclear material from the donor, what's actually being cloned, that's why I put a blue box around this, and they insert it into the donor cell from the other animal, right? Now, they use two different sheep for this, of course. You don't want to mix and match different species. I don't think it would even work that way. But you basically just take that cell, you put in the other DNA, and then here's where it gets like almost like Frankenstein. They actually directly put an electric current, like as a pulse, through that new cell, which was able to like kickstart a process where the cell more or less was able to start accepting the genetic material from the nuclear donor. That is a great oversimplification. I don't know the exact process. Again, this is extremely high-level science, but it's kind of fascinating when you look at how they did this. Bottom line is, after they directed the current through it and then got it to be like a living, almost embryo, really is what it was, they actually inserted it into what they called a surrogate. A surrogate is just someone who holds a baby for someone else, basically. So in other words, they had another sheep that basically had this inserted into them, and then they were able to grow a baby sheep that became Dolly the sheep. And after investigating Dolly's DNA, they determined it was an actual genetic clone, of course, of that donor. Whew, long story short, that's all over. All right, biotechnology, we're almost done here. So technology that is used for artificial selection, so humans selecting certain traits, is actually called biotechnology. Pretty simple name, biotechnology, living technology, right? There are several different types that we have to look at. You might be familiar with some of these. You've probably heard of some of these before. The first one is called artificial insemination. This is a really common one on farms. Sperm is harvested from a male with desired characteristics and then injected into a female with desired characteristics. And again, that's very common in livestock breeding, right? They do that very, very frequently. The next one is called in vitro fertilization. This is fertilization that happens outside the body, usually in something called a petri dish. Petri dish is just like a little plastic dish that often has some sort of like solution in it or some sort of like gel where you can grow certain cultures on it. But anyway, the fertilization happens in that petri dish, and then the developing embryo, which remember an embryo is a growing zygote. You know, a zygote becomes an embryo, and then an embryo becomes a baby, basically. That growing embryo is then placed inside of a female who carries it again as a surrogate. There you go, as a surrogate to be born. Now, this is also done with livestock breeding, but this is also used in humans for couples that are having a hard time getting pregnant, right? So if there's difficulty with a couple having a baby, then in vitro fertilization is, of course, an option. Now, oftentimes, though, with human beings, the surrogate is the actual mother themselves. It's not just someone else. But anyway, that's a long story short. Next up, genetic engineering. This one's a little more controversial. This is where parts of DNA from one organism are implanted into another organism. Genetic engineering has been used a lot in the agriculture industry. It's actually a very important part of the agricultural industry. And it's produced organisms that are very beneficial and have a lot of really good traits. However, we'll get to that in just a second. One thing I do want to mention, though, is another application of genetic engineering, where we're taking parts of DNA and putting it into another thing, is actually the production of insulin. Now, insulin, in case you're not aware, is a hormone in your body that is used to regulate your body's use of sugar. So any sugar that you consume, whether it's like just total literal raw sugar from something sweet, or even if it's like from bread, which has carbohydrates in it, which is a type of sugar, insulin is used to pretty much like regulate that, right? Because your blood has to have a certain amount of sugar in it, and insulin controls that. Now, diabetes is a condition where your body either doesn't make enough insulin, or your body just isn't using the insulin that you have effectively, right? Very, very common condition. It happens quite frequently, right? Now, the human gene for producing insulin has actually been genetically engineered to be inserted into a certain type of bacteria, which is used in facilities that produce insulin. So insulin is produced in like these facilities that have this bacteria that has been inserted with human genes through genetic engineering to produce insulin. That insulin is then harvested, and then that's what's mass produced and given out to people who have diabetes. And it has been absolutely crucial in extending the life of so many people that suffer from diabetes. It is a very valuable thing. So genetic engineering has had some awesome applications in society. Now, with biotechnology and food, just coming back to this, as mentioned before, the agricultural industry has used genetic engineering extensively. Plants that have undergone genetic engineering are often called GMOs, or in other words, genetically modified organisms. Now, there's a lot of like debate about GMOs. There are some people who just think, oh, GMOs, they're not a good thing. Science has actually shown there is no negative effect for humans eating GMOs. There is nothing to say that GMOs are bad for you. The science is not there. There's some other issues with GMOs that come with the corporations that own GMOs, and that comes into a big discussion, but that can be saved for a totally different time. We're not going to worry about that right now in science class, right? So genes from crops that grow quickly have been inserted into the DNA of other crops to make them grow quickly as well, right? So in other words, that's a very common application of GMOs. It's to get crops to grow much quicker. And that's really useful for places like southern Alberta, which really don't have a very long growing season compared to a lot of other places. You want your crop to grow very quickly because, like, let's face it, you know, it's winter at least half the year, right? You have to be able to grow your crop relatively quickly. Another application was a cold-resistant gene from fish, believe it or not. They actually extracted a gene from a certain type of fish, and they've inserted it into tomato DNA to help those tomatoes withstand cold temperatures. So the fish was able to sustain itself under really cold conditions. And they found that that gene was something that would be compatible with tomato DNA. And they were able to insert it into the DNA of tomatoes to get that to work. This is what freaks a lot of people out about GMOs. And I think this is some of the reason there's some pushback about it. You hear that and you go, oh, gross, there's fish in my tomatoes. Well, no. Remember, DNA is a double helix. Let's see if I can even draw this. It's like a double helix pattern where there are links within that double helix. Those links form a code, right? There's different segments and that forms a code. That code is a gene, right? all you're doing is you're taking that gene, in other words, that code, and you're changing the tomato's code to have that code built in. That's all that is. It's not that there's fish in your tomatoes. It's just that that chain in your DNA has been put in there. That's it. Okay, so just making that very clear. You're more than able to be opposed to GMOs if you're one of those people. That is fine. You have a choice over what food you eat, and that is respectable. But I'm just saying that you're not eating fish when you're eating these kinds of tomatoes. That's not how it works. Now, many plants, including cotton, corn, and potatoes, have also been engineered to produce something called Bt toxin, which is harmless to humans, but it's actually toxic to insects that eat the plants. And that reduces the need to spray pesticides on the crops because, of course, if you have a genetically modified corn plant, let's say, that has Bt toxin being produced, when pests like certain insects come and try to eat the corn, they'll eat a little bit of the corn, and then the Bt toxin, which is toxic to them, will kill those insects off, and therefore the corn can continue to recover and grow to, a full, plant, right? This does reduce the need to spray pesticides because, of course, the plant itself is taking care of the problem. That's another application of it. And again, Bt toxin is harmless to humans. It has no flavor, nothing like that, but it has been useful. So they've selectively done this to make sure that it's safe. There are some risks of biotechnology, however, and it's important that we discuss the ones that have been proved, right? In animals, biotechnology, so we're not just talking about genetically modifying them, we're not just talking about cloning and all that, we're also talking about in vitro fertilization as well as artificial insemination. Biotechnology can lead to reduced genetic diversity. In other words, those traits that are so desirable might actually have some issues built into them that we're not directly seeing. So this can make livestock more susceptible to certain diseases, right? We've talked about this before. Having lower genetic diversity can actually be a pretty bad thing, because then if there's a disease that targets a certain gene that everyone has, then we're in trouble, right? Now there's some risks that the process can also go wrong. So there's a higher chance of unsuccessful pregnancies or even birth defects when this happens, right? This is still rare, but it's still a viable issue. It's still something that's worth mentioning. There are issues with biotechnology in that it's not often as successful, right? Now in plants, the idea of reduced biodiversity is also a problem for plants. So in other words, plants can get disease as well. If they all have the same gene, then it can affect the whole plant. Going back to the concept of bananas, remember I told you all bananas are actually genetic clones of each other. So it's not just that they have one certain gene, they are literally genetically identical 100%. They have the same DNA all around. There's a disease that has a pretty interesting name. I think the disease is called tropical race 4, which I know that sounds like the name of like a Fast and the Furious movie or something like that, but that is the name of the disease. I'm pretty sure. I'll have to get back to you if it isn't. So if you hear from me, it's wrong. If you don't hear from me, that is right. But tropical race 4, I believe, is the name of a disease that is threatening to destroy banana plantations all around the world, because all bananas, being genetically identical, are very susceptible to this disease, and this disease could wipe out an entire plantation, even if it just struck one plant, right? Pretty scary. Now, genetically engineered crops could also interbreed with certain weeds as well, making the weeds gain the benefits of the crops, such as resistance to pests and herbicides. That becomes a bad thing. If you have a certain crop that is susceptible to herbicides that you spray on it, so herbicides, of course, kill weeds, and then the weeds gain that gene, well, now you have a problem. Now you can't spray your herbicide on them anymore, because now the herbicide won't work on the weeds. This has actually happened with certain canola crops. And it's really hard to get around this, because it's like, how do you control your canola plant from interbreeding with any of the weeds that blow onto your field, right? It's a real big struggle. And of course, people in the agriculture industry, this is something that they would have to deal with, right? It is a serious concern. All right, we're done. That was kind of a longer lesson. I apologize. But page 71, questions 1, 2, and then 4 to 8. So in other words, you're skipping question 3. Please get those done. If you have any questions with this, let me know. And remember, if you don't have a textbook, I have included them under week 5. You can find it in there. It's just these questions. It's nothing else, but it is page 71. Anyway, best of luck. Contact me if you need any help.